Chamaya. It's like papaya, except it's not. And this is Plot Twist Please. Today, I'm in a little bit of a different spot if you're watching. And I am sitting on my couch if you are listening. And I kind of thought that if I set it up in a cozier environment for these podcast episodes that are so long and so extensive, then this might be the way to do that. So bear with me and let's just try this out. If you don't know what Plot Twist Please is, it is a place where I like to talk about media and mental health and the intersection of those things. And today I'm very specifically in this episode going to be talking about the autism community and how we define community at large when it pertains to the internet, because the internet is a vast space and there's a lot going on over here where you're listening to this. Hold on, I'm just checking my sound real quick. Is the autistic online community okay? That's something I've been asking myself as of late. There's just been lots of hubbub and chatter about eugenics and about some, high functioning autistic people being superior than lower functioning autistic people, and using all this language that just doesn't make a ton of sense to me. I mean, I understand like from a structural standpoint where that comes from, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. But there's just a lot of language that I think people have been using that just really makes me feel like we're really going backwards. Like we are harming people while we're trying to help them. I really think we have to think about what we're putting out there. I think we need to remember, if you are somebody who talks about autism or talks about mental health online, you have to remember that whether this is just a hobby for you or an actual career path for you, there are people who are listening to you and looking up to you and who are taking your advice or who are taking notes and using what you're saying as a word of law. And you have to hold some responsibility for that. You have to hold responsibility for the communities that you are supporting when you use certain language. So yeah, I'm gonna be talking about that and just the idea of community within the autistic online community, because we're going through it, y'all. Like, there's a lot, but I'm just going to start by saying, please like, share, and subscribe if you feel so led. Also, if you want to see some cool things to decorate your home with to make it cozier, check out the Etsy link in the description. I am selling wall art that I made myself. There are some, common quotes on some of the wall art, as well as some graphics that I designed. And you know what? Check that out if you want to, if you feel led. And join the Patreon if you want to hear more intimate details about my life as an autistic Black woman and how I navigate it, because it's not easy. And I know there's some of you out there just like me who really just are trying to figure it all out in this kooky coconut world. So let's get into it. Something that I've been thinking about lately is the fact that community looks really different now than I think it has in the past, 50 years, because of the huge internet boom and how much we rely on the internet for daily functioning. Like, if we think about what it would be like to spend an entire day offline, odds are you couldn't get a lot done. You wouldn't be able to get work done. You wouldn't be able to get to your workplace without Google Maps or without an Uber or without checking how far away the train or the bus is from your location. There are just lots of things you couldn't do literally to function in society, in Western society specifically, without the internet. And I just want to make it really plain. Whenever I'm doing, stuff for Plot Twist Please, it's very specifically from a Western lens. So, when I'm talking about culture, when I'm talking about politics or, media and mental health, I'm specifically talking about it from the Western Americanized point of view. Because I know that America is not the center of the world. I understand that, and I just want to make that very clear. Community looks so different now, especially because of the COVID-19 pandemic, where people almost relied entirely on the internet to socialize and to stay connected to their peers and to their loved ones. Because what else were we going to do if we couldn't see people, we couldn't touch people physically? We only had the internet. And there's going to be a study, I know, in the next 2 or 3 years about how that experience has impacted our ability to connect, and more specifically, I think teenagers and like the adolescent age group, how COVID-19 has impacted their ability to connect authentically, in physical spaces with other people. There's this really cool documentary on Netflix called Babies, where they talk about when a baby hasn't received physical touch from an adult or period, how that over time affects that baby psychologically, and how that baby even develops. So that is fascinating, and I think is very telling of how much humans actually need one-on-one or in-person interaction as opposed to social media. And I could go into this really tired spiel about how social media is poison, but that's not actually what I'm trying to do with this episode. That's not actually my point at all. But I think that actually takes away from the core of what I'm getting at. Listen a little longer, you know what I'm talking about. I think it's really interesting how there used to be town squares, and now I think the only form of a town square, i.e. a place where a bunch of people could congregate and do basically nothing but exist in each other's space, I think the only equivalent we have to that is a library. I don't have time, and if I do that, it's because I make time to do that, and I specifically carve out that hour or so of my day. But I don't think there's a space where people can necessarily congregate in Western society like how people would in a high school, in between classes, or in college. You go to the center of the college, or to the mess hall, or to wherever people tended to congregate between classes. But that wasn't because you carved out time to go to those spaces. It was because you happened to be there, because it was convenient for you to be there, and therefore it was convenient for other people to socialize with you, because at some point they knew that someone that they knew was going to be there. It seems like semantics, it seems like, little logistics, but convenience, I think, plays a big role in how we socialize, especially if we think about how busy people tend to be, especially now, that there's very little time to just sit. I think people romanticize having a vacation-like lifestyle, having a blissful, soft, quote-unquote, lifestyle, because we are so used to hustling and bustling. Society requires it of us in order to survive. Capitalism requires it of us. There is no taking a break. There's no room for that, because you have to keep making money to pay your rent and to build the life that you want, even if you are not sure what that life you want even looks like, but you just know that someone at some point told you that you're supposed to want that life, and so you aim for it relentlessly. I think it's imperative that in order to analyze how communities are formed, that we look at this article by The Guardian from 2014. It was called The Death of the American Mall, and it was talking about, and I've included a link in the description, so if you're watching this, go ahead and click that link to, read up on that. But it was basically talking about how the American mall, what it stood for, and how it functions in actuality is kind of obsolete, because people don't go to malls anymore and they only shop online. That's what the writer is arguing. But I think that I don't know, that's an easy answer. I think that's just so convenient to say social media is making our lives harder rather than easier. And yes, I'm going to get, if you're like, Shamaya, like, wait, there's actual data behind this, like, I'm gonna get there, but I need to get past this stuff first. I want to point your attention to another article that is arguing against the notion that American malls are dead. I think it's kind of funny because when I watched the documentary on Netflix that was about Abercrombie and Fitch, it's called White Hot, I actually did a review of that documentary, and you can check that out. If you click this link, that'll appear here, or maybe it won't, maybe it'll appear at the end of the video. And if you're listening, that's on the YouTube channel and also on the podcast. It's called Does White Equal Cool, or something of that nature. Check it out. But anywho, what was interesting about the documentary, and this is a little bit of a segue, but I promise I have a point, is that at the beginning of the documentary, you kind of were like, as an audience member, sitting there and listening to them describe what a mall was. And it just made it so apparent to me that there's a big demographic that doesn't, or is perceived to not have an intimate relationship with the concept of a mall, or didn't grow up with malls, or, you know, the malls just seem like something from Stranger Things, but they've never actually been immersed into that culture. And that was fascinating to me because I was like, oh, like, have we gone so far in the direction of online sales and online stores that no one is going to malls at all? But then I thought to myself, if that's true, how are there still malls? Like, how are they still here? Like, the mall that I went to growing up in my hometown is still there. So it just got me to thinking. And then I came across this article when I was doing some digging. So this article is a published work by Deloitte. And basically what I thought was really interesting about this article is that it pointed out how millennials are constantly the like identifier, or like the group that everyone studies when a new trend is happening, and everything that millennials do is measured. Like if millennials like one thing, then to culture critics or to, you know, culture commentators or people who analyze market trends even more specifically, if millennials like something, then it's like, okay, everyone likes this one thing, so every company needs to draw their attention to this one thing to attract millennials. And granted, I get that because millennials do have a lot of buying power. Like if a millennial buys something, then they'll tell their friends about it. And if they really like that thing, then their friends will tell their friends about it. And then, you know, it spreads like wildfire. And then it's a lot of economic speak, but basically like your revenue goes up and your company makes more money because all these people are telling their friends about your product. But what's interesting is that article pointed out how millennials are not a dependable enough marker for how trends are moving, because there's the upper class, there's the middle class, there's the lower middle class, and then there's the lower class, which is basically the middle class and the lower middle class at this point. But it was interesting how it identified the flaw in using millennials as the trend setters, because though it seems that millennials don't go to shopping at malls anymore and therefore malls are dying, what's actually happening is millennials who belong to the higher class demographic are not shopping in person as much as lower income people in general. So it's not so much about like millennials or Gen Z or Gen X when it comes to retail versus online shopping. It's about how much money you make and how much disposable income you have. Because if you have a bunch of disposable income, you're more inclined to spend money on these luxury goods and, you know, Louis Vuitton and all these brands that have online stores just like ready to go. But if you are someone who does not have that kind of cash to be spending every weekend, you'll shop at those in-person retail stores that are discount stores. So you'll go thrift shopping, or you go to like Dollar Tree, Dollar General, or you go to the Kmart, you go to the Target, to those discount stores, because you need that item, you need those products at a low price. That's the appeal, is you are going to go to the in-person retail brick and mortar store, you're going to get something at a discount price. You're not looking for the finest fabrics, you're not looking for the best possible premium product, you're just looking to something to get you through the week, or to get you through, you know, your daily ins and outs. But if you're someone who has a bunch of money to spend online, then you're going to do it. When we get into like the fast fashion discussion, that I think that exists on a different plane. But the stores that aren't exactly appealing to people, or appealing to consumers because of their extremely low prices, nor are they appealing to consumers because of their convenience or the experience or the premium brand name. The stores that aren't doing well are the ones who exist in the middle, who aren't offering either of those things more than those two groups, if that makes any sense. Like they're not offering it as consistently as those two groups. Yeah, I brought up that debate of the relevance of malls to point out the fact that the conclusion that you come to is completely going to depend on the lens through which you're looking and how you define the subject that you're looking at. Like, does that make sense? I tried to like really break this down, but I think I may have made it more complicated. Please let me know in the comments if the way that I explain things doesn't actually make sense, but just makes it more confusing. Please let me know if you gained something from this episode, because I really love to know if what I'm offering is digestible for people, for the average person. Just wanted to point that out before moving forward. How you group different communities, how you categorize them is everything. Now, the internet is all about community. The internet is about connecting. And the social media apps, the platforms that do extremely well are the ones that capitalize on that notion, and the ones that are really able to dig their heels into what forms a community and what keeps people coming back. There's a core element that they tap into that is not easy to tap into. And as someone who works in social media, as someone who, does social media management for brands and who has clients who I help curate their social media presence, it is not as easy as it looks to create a community. It is not as easy as it looks to foster genuine connections online. I think everyone's pretty much caught up to the fact that the internet is the future, and it's going to be one of the main sources of literally everything, of health, of food, of doing anything, of going through any sort of daily process of living your life. But I think the thing that maybe freaks people out about the internet is the fact that there's so much that is not under your control once you log on. Once you log on, someone can take your information. Someone can tap into your private accounts. Once you log on, especially once you post something, someone can perceive you. I don't love being perceived, but this is the industry I've chosen, right? I think that people are afraid of putting something out there, posting something or sharing something, and then it ending up in a place that they didn't anticipate it ending up, in a place that they didn't want it to end up. That stuff is up there forever, even if you delete it. It's a scary place, or rather it can be. I also forgot to mention this. It can be a source of misinformation. It can be a source of, bullying. It can be a playground for predators. It can be a scary place. But I also hope that people understand, and I think a lot of people do, that it can also be a safe haven for people who don't find solace in their everyday lives with physical communities that they can interact with in person. I think that a lot of people, maybe people who are socially awkward, maybe people who are neurodivergent, maybe people who are lonely, are anxious, or literally physically cannot get to the outside world for whatever reason, it can be incredibly helpful for them, for their mental health, for their well-being. And that brings me to the self-diagnosis question. This is a part of this episode where I talk about autism and self-diagnosis in relation to the internet. So let's first talk about who is self-diagnosing. So the people who are self-diagnosing are, from my understanding, and as I've observed, are people who don't have access to healthcare that can allow them to get a formal diagnosis. People who don't have the funds, who don't have the money to pay the thousands of dollars that it takes to get a diagnosis from a professional. And yes, it is thousands of dollars, because I've searched, I've looked, it's at least $3,000 at least, unless you have really good insurance. Most of the people who are self-diagnosing, from what I've seen, have been people of color, people of marginalized identities, who wouldn't necessarily benefit from the structure of the psychiatric system in America, because it is not built for them and it has never been suited for them. And I want to just say right off the bat that I'm not a mental health professional. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a psychologist. I did not go to school and get a degree to tell you whether or not you're autistic. But what I do know, as an autistic person who has moved through the world as an autistic person, and more so as a Black autistic woman, what I can tell you is that a lot of experts have no idea, have no idea what it is like to walk in your shoes, to live your life. And along with that, I do suggest looking extensively for answers and not listening to a random person online when they say that you maybe sort of have something, or that you maybe sort of fit in this identity, when they do not know you and who have never had a conversation with you. So that I will say. But yes, sometimes the professionals or the experts don't have the full scope of what can be going on, because the psychology field, the psychiatry field is flawed and is rooted in white supremacist anti-Blackness. And that is, I think, a big point of contention that a lot of professionals, mental health professionals, are trying to grapple with. But that's why it's always better to have lots of different opinions. It's always better to do lots and lots of research than to just take one person's word for it. That I will say. So those are the people who are self-diagnosing. I find it interesting that a lot of the time I'll find someone on TikTok or wherever, and they'll be making some really just half-baked takes and unresearched conclusions about their autistic experience, and not even about their autistic experience, I would say, but they will make very generalized statements about autism. And you can just tell that they haven't sat with these ideas, that they're kind of just theorizing based off of very little concrete information, or based off of very little research. And that is the part that concerns me. So I want to talk about now intent when it comes to self-diagnosed autistics who are sharing information online. I think that I generally am someone who wants to give people the benefit of the doubt, and I do believe that these people who are sharing this information online think that they are doing a greater public service. I do think that they believe they're doing the right thing and that they're helping someone improve their life. And sharing maybe legitimate information. But to put it in layman's terms, just because you believe something is true doesn't make it true. Just because something has happened with you, something has happened for you in your life and your artistic experience, doesn't mean that happens to everybody. And I try to be very clear and very specific when I make claims like, this is how autism manifests. And I very seldom say phrases like, this, like, if you are autistic, then this will happen to you. What I will typically say is a lot of the time, autistic people experience this, because what it is based on a list of diagnostic criteria. I really try to always include the diagnostic criteria when I'm talking about the autistic experience, because you cannot be autistic if you do not fit that criteria. Yes, it's flawed. Yes, it is from a patriarchal white supremacist lens, but it's what we got. According to the DSM-5, if you don't have those boxes checked, you are not autistic. And that needs to be said, and that needs to be understood, because like, at the end of the day, it is about the criteria. That is within the structure that we're working with, that is the criteria. And within the structure that we're working with, that is what autism is. Now we can talk about how that criteria might need to change in the next few years. We can talk about how people experience those characteristics differently. And maybe I'll put a link in this description of what that criteria is. But the bottom line, that's what it is. That's what it is, fam. And that's what makes it hard, is because I know that a lot of the people who are sharing this information, or rather misinformation, probably are doing what they think is right. I would rather someone be well-researched. I would rather someone put out disclaimers. I would rather someone say, I don't know it all. I don't have all the answers. I am not a certified professional. Than for someone to be out here confusing people. Because what if someone starts to take medication because of something that they think that they have, and it ends up really like jumbling their brain, it ends up really messing them up? Then that's on you. Because you can also always say, this is my experience as someone who experiences this mental health issue, as someone who is autistic, or someone who is bipolar, or et cetera, XYZ. You can always say, this is my experience. This might not necessarily be everyone's experience. That is okay. That is all right. Really. No one's going to be mad at you for experiencing things the way you experience them. Or rather, they shouldn't. But I really think people need to be more intentional about the language that they use when talking about their mental health struggles. And if that seems too hefty a feat, then don't talk about it. Don't talk about it, because the risk is too great. You don't have to talk about it. And that's hard, because it feels like the internet should be this free space where you can talk about whatever you want. But what you do on the internet has consequences. Obviously it does. So, how do you properly self-diagnose? I would suggest looking up the diagnostic criteria, looking up how to read the criteria and how to apply it if you feel like it does apply to you. I've included links to a couple of autism spectrum disorder tests. You can see where you lie when it comes to that criteria. After doing that, I would really deeply research how these characteristics manifest within someone who has your identity. So if you're a Black person, I would look up how autism spectrum disorder shows up in Black people in our communities. I would look up how autism can be confused with other disorders, different comorbid disorders. Comorbid just means things that can occur at the same time. And I would look at that research extensively, and I would bring them to a professional, keep a list of the characteristics of autism that you think you have. I would mark when you experience these things. Like if you're like, oh, I was on the bus today and there's music playing all the way through the bus, like on the other side of the bus, and I heard it and it felt like I was having a meltdown. I would record the exact sensations that you feel, the exact time of day that you felt them. And I would keep like a little journal of all those things, of when you feel like you might be experiencing sensory overload, what those sensations feel like. And I would gather all that material that's, printed out forms of the research that you've done, your notebook containing all these different things that you've experienced that you think align with the diagnostic criteria of autism. I would include studies that you've looked through, peer-reviewed studies of potential comorbid disorders or mental health issues. I would look up what something could be that is not autism that you could have, because there are things that look like autism that aren't necessarily autism. I think ADHD gets confused. Well, ADHD can be confused with autism sometimes if you're just looking at it as an observer. OCD can be confused with autism sometimes, or vice versa. And you might have to check up on that, but they tend to get confused. Bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder tends to get confused with autism within women specifically, or AFABs. At the end of all that, if you really think that it's autism, bring all of that stuff that I just mentioned to your therapist and make a case. Because if there's one thing I've learned, is that the therapists, especially if they're not constantly, keeping up with how psychology studies are moving, how the world is shifting, if they're not constantly keeping up with that research, you might have to school them a little bit. You might have to, flex a little bit and share them a little bit of your knowledge. But have your facts, have your binder, have your facts. And I also want to point out that it's not necessarily beneficial for everyone to get an official diagnosis. Sometimes when it comes to taxes, it makes it harder for you to get benefits. It makes it difficult for you to receive care for, regular things like a physical or, other things. I don't know specifically physical on that list, but it makes it harder sometimes. So yeah, double check and make sure that it's actually something that you want a formal diagnosis for. And if not, you really don't have to get a formal diagnosis. You really don't. If you don't actually need it, then I would say no. I would say do what you think is best for you, but you may not always need a formal diagnosis. Sorry, I'm going on to my next point because I really am just like going so through these points. I'm talking a lot. Okay, now I want to talk about Asperger's as a concept and the next stage of evolution. I titled this part eugenics ? Because that's basically what it is. So there's a huge conversation online about how autism is basically the next stage of evolution. And when the people say this, a lot of the time what they're referring to is Asperger's, or rather what is classified by a lot of non-autistic people as high-functioning autism. And if you know anything about Hans Asperger, who is, the root of where the term Asperger's comes from, you know that he was actually a Nazi sympathizer. Oh, I'm so sorry. Trigger warning, Nazis, anti-Semitism. So Hans Asperger was a Nazi sympathizer, and the way to categorize the autistic people, or, the autistic people at that time, was by whether or not they had Asperger's. And if they had Asperger's, then they weren't going to get, in the chambers. But if they were autistic, then they would. And so that was the signifier of whether or not basically someone deserved to live and they fit in the autism category. So that is why I have a huge issue with when people are talking about how autism is the next stage of evolution, because what you're talking about is high functioning autism. That's what you're actually talking about. You know, you're not talking about the nonverbal autistics. You're not talking about the high support need autistics. That's not what you're talking about. And I also want to point out the fact that high functioning and low functioning, those labels mostly benefit non-autistic people and don't actually give, in a lot of cases, they don't give a very concrete idea of what someone actually needs who's on the autism spectrum. So a lot of the time, if someone is, quote, high functioning, means they blend in well in society, in neurotypical society or non-autistic society, and low functioning means they don't. And these terms don't really benefit us because what we're not paying attention to is the actual need. I feel like high support and low support needs are more like flexible terms, but I even don't think that those fully encompass what they're trying to get at, because would be considered, quote, low support needs, but I literally can't tell when I'm hungry. And I also resent the notion that if we lived in a society that was not dominated by neurotypicals, then we wouldn't have the needs that we have. Because I don't think that's true. I think that we would still need to know when we're hungry. I think we would still need to be organized. We would still need to remember to, you know, take vitamins and to eat and to sleep and to shower. We would still need those things, whether society was set up for us or not. So it just reminds me of these phrases that are really just almost in an attempt to be really like progressive and inclusive are actually reductive and don't actually solve real problems. And it might seem like I'm contradicting my point of language being important, because language is important. But I also think that language is allowed to be fluid. And I think that when we're talking about things that are constantly changing, like how we approach disability, like how society approaches disability, I think that there has to be room for that flexibility, while also understanding the stakes of that language. I hope that makes sense, y'all. Or maybe I'm just tired and I'm rambling. Anyway, next point. This notion of autism being the next wave of evolution, which is really problematic, because when we're talking about any group of people being the next wave of evolution, it is giving this harsh eugenics vibes, and it is linked to white supremacy. Now, more specifically, it is giving room for Aspie supremacy to emerge. Now, Aspie supremacy is closely aligned with white supremacy because basically a screw within the Nazi anti-Semitist machine. So many thorough articles on this. There's one about the patriarchy from rootedinrights.org. It's about how we tend to blame autism for capitalist and white supremacist violence. And it's such a good read. I'm not going to go into it too deeply. I've linked also in the description. So basically, Crip theory challenges what makes certain bodies, certain identities normal or as abject, and what makes something the standard in terms of how bodies exist in the world. That's basically what Crip theory is getting at. There are other, forms of oppression that align with Crip theory. I have been really intentional about this, or about my language when it comes to teaching children. Like if I'm teaching them drama class, like maybe I'm reading them a book and there's a character who doesn't have an arm, or like a character in a wheelchair, a character who is physically impaired, visibly. I will point it out, like this person looks like they're in a wheelchair. And then I'll kind of move on, because I hope to normalize that as much as possible. I hope to normalize the existence of disabled bodies as much as possible, and not to trivialize them, and not to, be like, oh, like you don't have arms. Because I almost feel like normalizing it while also acknowledging the societal struggles that come with those identities. And maybe this is above my pay grade. Maybe this is beyond my scope, but I think that a combination of normalizing those identities and acknowledging the harsh reality of the world that we live in is paramount to really humanizing those people. Because I as a Black person, I've found that when someone just like pretends like I'm not Black, that's not real life. That's not real life. That's erasure. Like, that hurts. But if someone acknowledges that I'm Black and is like, oh, all you experience is fun, good times in America, right? Then that also sucks. Like, that's not helpful either. Oppression exists. And I think across lots of different theories of marginalized communities, you can acknowledge that that's a common theme. Taking it back to autism internet culture as it pertains to Aspie supremacy, saying that a particular identity is superhuman can be almost as harmful as claiming that that identity doesn't exist. Y'all, my notes just froze. Are you kidding? My notes are frozen. Okay, I realized that I'm not going to be able to record this entire episode and give it its due diligence and be as thorough as I want to be. So I am going to have to cut this episode short and am going to record a part 2. So what an impromptu decision. This episode will be released in 2 parts. Please tune in for both of them if you want the full, analysis of what I'm talking about here. My links to the citations and the references that I mentioned in this video, they will be in the description. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Yeah, but that's all I have for you today. Tune in for part 2. Stay weird. Bye-bye.